All right. Well, thanks everyone so much for being here. Those of you who are here live, those of you watching the recording, sorry we missed you, but thanks for tuning in now. We are so thrilled today to be talking to a dear friend of mine, Hibby Thach, about live streaming, VTubers, PNGTubers, and all variety of things trans technology. Hibby is, I think, the third speaker in our Playful Horizons speaker series, which is an event we're running all semester long, where we bring in various emerging rock stars in the field of game and media studies and design. Our next speaker will be next week. We're talking to Kit Chalkley, who's a PhD student at McGill University, who will be talking to us a little bit about trans and queer folks and social media and play. But today we have the privilege of talking to someone who is probably much more familiar with things like OBS and the various streaming tools I am using to run this event. Hibby Thach, who uses she and they pronouns, is a second-year PhD student at the University of Michigan School of Information. She studies live streaming, content moderation, and queer and trans people of color's experiences with technologies and platforms. In their spare time, they are playing gacha games, JRPGs, creature catchers, and the occasional cozy game. She is also an avid RHO SLC fan and loves reality trash TV. As part of her streaming research, she also runs a Twitch channel at HibbyBoBibby, where she streams variety content. And the last cool thing about her, she plays fun characters in tabletop campaigns with Dr. Berge. That is true, we do that. In any case, thank you again, Hibby, for being here. I'm going to kick things off with the first question that we've been asking all of our speakers, which is, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself? What's your academic background, and what got you into studying games and media?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me. I'm in my advisor's office because he's out of the office, so I get to have a fancy office in the background.
Just pretend it's yours.
So
We
a
won't
little
know the
bit.
difference.
Yeah, this is mine. I'm claiming this. But yeah, I am a first gen student. I grew up not knowing what grad school was. And then when grad school came around, I was like, oh, cool. And like I had a resource, my partner at the time, who helped me sort of figure out grad school. Because if you don't know what grad school is or how to do grad school, it's kind of hard to get into grad school. So I'm very lucky I had that. And I went to undergrad at Temple University for sociology. I went to UIC remotely during the beginning of the pandemic, at UIC for communication for my MA, and now I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan School of Information. So I've been through a lot of different programs. I was also an art school dropout, so that's fun. And what else did you ask me? Sorry.
Yeah, what got you into studying games and media?
Yeah, so I grew up very much online and like hooked on games. I don't think my parents realized at the time, but I think I was going through some stimming and tisming at the beginning of my childhood. I would be so obsessed with games, like get so like energetic, jump up and down sort of thing. And games have just been like a special part of my life, all my life, really. And it was in undergrad at Temple where I don't remember if I was taking her class at the time, but I heard about this cool scholar named Dr. Adrian Shaw, who, if people know, runs the LGBTQ video game archive, has done a lot of stuff on queer game studies, stuff like that. And I met her and I talked to her about video games, and she was like, would you like to be my research assistant? So then from there, I was like, oh, games are cool, let's study them. And ever since, I've just been in game studies, and I've pivoted to like media comm info now, and that's how I'm here today.
No, that's fantastic. Most of the students who are here in the audience now have been in my queer and trans game studies class, and so we are all familiar with Adrian Shaw, and we've had a chance to take a look at the archive, and that's really cool that you kind of had that experience. And I'll also just note for those in the room, yes, grad school can be incredibly difficult to like decipher. And if that is the thing anyone ever has questions about, like, do let your professors know. We are always happy to like chat with you about what that looks like and demystify what can be a very kind of insulated process. Now, Hibby, I know a lot of your work recently has focused on the phenomenon of VTubers and PNGTubers, folks who use virtual avatars as part of their live streaming personas. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and what you found from your conversations with various content creators in this area?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm actually very excited about this question because we're currently writing up research right now to hopefully submit to a journal related to like the VTuber stuff. So yay, finally getting published about this stuff. But yeah, I in the past like year and a half or so since I started my stream, I've been interviewing, I think it was 15 multi-marginalized Twitch streamers about their experiences, navigating Twitch's like platform, the toxic technoculture, or like an anti-progressive, anti-diversity sort of like platform culture. And a lot of them, actually probably about half of the people I interviewed, used VTubing or PNGTuber technologies, which if you didn't know, is sort of imagine an avatar. It could be 2D, 3D, and it could be motion captured by your face, your movements, or like me, who doesn't have the technology to do something that fancy, you could use like a VTuber program like VAtotube Mini, I think is one on itch.io, that I use to just switch through 4 different facial expressions for my PNG tuber and like sort of make my PNG tuber move manually. But it's a way to present as just, this cool little avatar that moves in some way, whether it's 3D or 2D. And from my conversations with the various like VTubers and PNGTubers, I'm finding some really interesting, yeah, really different jobs. I'm finding some really interesting stuff about how a lot of them are talking about this, and I'm sure people in the crowd, if you're on social media, if you are queer or trans in some way, about the act of like being seen but not perceived. And a lot of them are using the VTuber or PNGTuber to sort of help with anything related to their disability or like discomfort around being seen on camera, but still being able to stream, monetize their stream, have successful reach, stuff like that, just as an avatar rather than using their face. And a lot of people also are talking about using it as like aspirational sort of like transition, especially like trans streamers I'm talking about. I am one of those people. I'm not an interviewee, but I relate very hard to that. I have 2 interviewees who, one had made a VTuber model that was more like, traditional gender norms, feminine, like this is what I'm aspiring to be as a trans woman, and transitioned alongside using that VTuber. And then another one was another trans person transitioning, but was like, what if I had something more aspirational or like speculative? And it's like this cool like witch sort of VTuber, and they transitioned while using that VTuber as well. So lots of cool stuff.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and exciting. And I am curious, I mean, just because our students might not be quite so familiar, at the start you talked about what we could call maybe anti-diversity or toxic cultures sort of existing within live streaming. Can you maybe clarify just a little bit more about that? Like, what's going on Twitch that could possibly be anti-diversity?
Right. What's going on that's possibly anti-diversity? I wonder. Well, I feel like whenever I talk about this, I always have to like mention Gamergate. So like, there has been a huge history in the gaming industry writ large of just sort of like these sexist, misogynistic ideals towards women, towards trans people, towards anyone who sort of differs from a default norm of a cisgender, heterosexual, white, able-bodied male. And this sort of like toxic culture around gaming has proliferated into today. We see this on Twitch In previous years, there have been a lot of marginalized streamers who faced hate raids, death threats, doxing, etc., stuff like that. So when the platform actively has this sort of culture that if you, as a marginalized person, stumble upon and you have those people in your audience, it doesn't feel great. It's not great to stream and then face all this hate and harassment. So when I talk about toxic technocultures, I draw from Adrian Massanari's work on Reddit, and the fappening is what I think Adrian calls it. And yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll try to put a link to Adrian's article in the chat, but I appreciate you kind of setting the stage for everyone, because I know we've talked about how these historic hate campaigns have proliferated through Gamergate, but we haven't talked about it specifically in the context of Twitch, where the policing of bodies is such a pressing issue. So one of the things I think that's really exciting and compelling about your work, Hibby, is that you yourself have been getting into live streaming. And, you know, I think there's sort of a merging of practice and theory and how you're trying to understand this. So what's that been like, being a researcher and stepping into the live streaming role yourself? How do you balance your role as a practitioner and as a PhD student? Also, would you mind introducing us to your own PNG tuber?
Yes, I would. Can I answer this as my PNG tuber? I can
Yes, of
like
course.
play with the
Absolutely.
stuff really quickly. I'm gonna make sure VAttitude is open real quickly, and then I'm gonna open OBS. I had this all open before, but then we were having technical
I know,
difficulties.
and then it was my fault. So, because the
No, you're
recording
good.
didn't see this, we had some mic issues at the beginning, and I was walking through Hibby through all these steps, and it turned out it was on my end. So, mea culpa.
All right. I should be able to switch to it if I change to my virtual camera right now. Yay!
Yay!
Okay. Here we go. Is Hoppy moving? Okay, Hoppy is moving. Yes. All right. Ask me that question one more time.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you balance sort of your role as a practitioner / live streamer and as a PhD student? Would you mind introducing us to your PNG tuber? And what's that been like, being a researcher and stepping into this role yourself? Also, I hope you see the reactions in the chat so
I
far.
do, and I
Some
love
big
it. I
love for
thrive off of
Hoppy.
it. Well, thank you for that question. But yeah, I'll start with the PNG tuber because I am talking as the PNG tuber. But hi everyone, this is Hoppy. I named it Hoppy because my stream name is Hibby Bobibby, and I think I was like, how can I keep on brand with the name of this? And I think it was Hibbity Hoppity, or Hoppy for short. So yeah, I love Hoppy. This is like sort of like, I was talking earlier about one of my interviewees who had sort of like a speculative gender sort of thing going on with their VTuber. That's sort of what's going on here. If I could be like this pastel, like clowny rabbit with a porcelain mask, I think that would be really cool. But for now, I'll stick with being a trans woman, I guess.
Both things can be true.
And then really, exactly, yes. So yeah, I started live streaming myself. I think it was September 26th, 2023, if I remember correctly. I had been working with Dr. Oliver Hameson, one of my 2 advisors at Michigan, on Twitch and content moderation for a while. And as we were doing these studies, like observing sort of the platform culture of Twitch and how content moderation works there, I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I like also streamed? Because in a lot of like anthropological work or digital anthropological work, you can perform a method called autoethnography or digital autoethnography. So I was like, I wonder if I can speak to other streamers and also stream myself to sort of like put myself in their shoes and sort of compare and contrast my experience to theirs. Obviously, I am in a very privileged position, being a PhD student, having access to like institutional resources, versus my streamers who very often have to self-fund themselves. So I always keep that in mind when I'm writing up stuff in my autoethnographic work. But it's been really cool, honestly. I'm glad I became a streamer because I was able to see firsthand what it's like dealing with OBS, with technical difficulties, with all this stuff, creating my own like PNG tuber, my branding, stuff like that. Um, it's been really cool, and it's helped a lot with getting into or getting access to the communities I want to be in conversation with. Because I feel like, especially for marginalized communities, especially those on a toxic technoculture or dealing with toxic technoculture on platforms like Twitch, it can be sort of hard to accept new people into the space or people that you're unfamiliar with because, for the potential of hate and harassment. So I really wanted to put myself in the shoes of other multi-marginalized streamers and sort of get that experience while also building trust with them. And that's helped a lot. I've gotten like a lot of amazing connections to these different communities. I'd like to shout out like the Gender Federation, Aegis, the Transverse, just wonderful places where queer and trans creators just come together to, be in community and stream. And I also think that as researchers, it's really important to put theory into practice or praxis, if you will. It's praxis, baby.
It's
Um,
practice, baby.
it's just really important. Yeah, it's just really important to, of course, talk about these complex topics, produce knowledge, but also focus on the actual lived experiences of people and make sure that theory is being put into practice so that we can help marginalized people, help the people that we are in community with, that we study and co-theorize with, help them to just live better lives and also publish, but
Yeah.
do all that on top of that.
And thank you so much for that answer. And I think it is really important to think about, because especially for those of us in media studies, it is really easy to kind of get excited about and interested in writing about a phenomenon, but there's a big difference between writing about that as a researcher outside of that practice, and as somebody who's participating in the nitty-gritty and the everyday of that practice yourself. And I will, just for everyone here, mention that thing that Hibby sort of, I think, very thoughtfully framed earlier about institutional resources. That is also the kind of thing where if you go on to a PhD program and you pitch a project like this, you can get your institution and your advisor, if there is funding, to do things like buy you a streaming setup, things like that to support your research project, which is doing graduate school does not always come with perks, but that is one of them. So yeah, thank you for that really thoughtful answer, Hibby. Well, I have one last question. Yes, thanks. I have one last question, sort of on that same note, because I'd love to talk a little bit about methods. I know you've been part of some fairly extensive interview-based studies, and I know some folks in my classes have expressed an interest in what we would call like ethnographic research, whether that's interviews or sort of player-based studies, actually talking to people. I know some of you are very averse to that because you socializing, but some of you are really excited by that possibility. So I'm curious, Hibby, if you could sort of speak to what that process has been like and how that shapes things for you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And also to people in the crowd who hate talking to people, I also do, to be honest. And for some reason, I do interview-based work because I don't know, it's different. It's sort of like there's a performance aspect to it for me, as opposed
Fair
to
enough.
like actually talking. But yeah, I love, I guess in my field and in like the social sciences, I would call it qualitative research. I really love interviews. I love ethnographic work because qualitative methods in general really help us to get at the why. Like, we see a lot of people talk about these quantitative stuff like statistics, surveys, etc., to get like a good idea of like people's sort of like opinions and like just numerical values to look at and be like, that's a chart that has numbers, yay. Which, quant is good in its own way, but I love qual because it helps us know the why. It helps us talk to people. It helps us know narratives. It helps us learn about stories. And I myself am just very passionate about storytelling in research and in life in general. So I've been a part of, ever since I started working with Dr. Oliver L. Hameson, I have done digital ethnographic work with him, which means I was going to specific, what we would call field sites. For me, that was Twitch. I was looking at a lot of streams in the just chatting category on Twitch where people just chat. And I was looking through these different streams, staying in them, noticing how sort of like conversations were going, what was happening with the streamers. And as I was doing this work, I was also taking notes. And then I would do that systematically over the course of like, I think when I was doing it, I would do it like 2 or 3 times a week. But for some ethnographers, some anthropologists, it's much more involved. Like a physical world anthropologist might go to a different country and like literally live somewhere and like take notes every day and literally live in the research. And you can do that as well with digital ethnography, but there's so many hours in the day. And then through that, we were able to sort of figure out who we could talk to in these spaces. And we reached out to them. And then if they were willing, we would talk to them and we would interview them and find out more. And then through something called snowball sampling, we were able to ask them, hey, do you know anyone else that could talk to us or would be open to talking to us? And as you do that, you start to develop this network of contacts. And it helps you sort of visualize what this digital space looks like who is talking to who is in community with who. But it also helps you get more interviewees and sort of learn more stories and more points of view about a place, a topic, etc., stuff like that. Yeah. Hopefully that was a good answer to your question.
Definitely. No, absolutely. Just for, I think to sort of ground like the scale of this, how many interviewees? You said you would talk to about 15 people for the project you're working on now. Is that standard for the work that you do? Like, how many participants do you usually end up interacting with for any given project?
Yeah. So the answer I would give to this that I feel like has been drilled into me since I started doing social science work is keep going until the data is saturated. Basically, keep going until you sort of are not finding anything new, or it doesn't seem like you're finding any new pertinent info, and it's sort of like the same stuff is being repeated. So that could be honestly anywhere from 6 interviews to my advisor, Dr. Ver. Why do I keep saying Dr. Ver?
I love it.
Oliver, for his recent book, Trans Technologies, published by MIT Press. I mentioned it in a few times, yay. He interviewed, I don't know the exact number, it's like over 100 interviewees, and I conducted some of those. And that's a lot. That's like, I don't think people normally conduct that many interviews. That was like for a large book scale project. So honestly, it can be anywhere from like 6 to like that huge amount. It just depends on the project you're doing and like what you're seeing, what themes are coming up in the data for you.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Also, I appreciate the very subtle plugs to Oliver's book, which, much to my frustration, his new book, Trans Technologies, came out, last week? 2 weeks ago? Which I've been mad about because I wanted to assign it. So in any case, we'll probably be reading a chapter of it in one of our last weeks of class in my trans and queer game design class. But at the very least, if you want to check that out for yourself, I did just put a link in the chat. But fantastic. Thank you for sort of talking us through the method side of things there, Hibby. And at this point, I think we're going to pivot and we're actually going to open this up to any questions from you all who are here with us in the audience. We've got a smaller group today, so you're welcome to post any questions that you have for Hibby up in the speaker questions channel, or just honestly put them in the chat here on the side. And then if somebody asks a question that you really adore, don't forget to react to it, just so that I'm more likely to see it and be able to redirect it here to Hibby and Hoppy. I'm glad that the PNGTuber has stuck around. So our first question comes from what are some of your findings so far from talking to your streamer interviewees? And then edited to add, if that's okay to ask. Yes, that's
Of
very okay to
course.
ask.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, I love your avatar. Is that Chikawa? I think I watched Jaden Animations, and Jaden Animations is like obsessed with Chikawa. I'm glad. I'm glad. But yeah, like I said before, I have those findings about like the VTubers and PNGTubers, but also generally, I'm finding a lot about okay, for reference, when I usually do interview studies or ethnographic studies, we will meet as a team, whoever I'm working with. After I've transcribed all the interviews, I've coded them, which basically means I'm going through, finding themes, highlighting those themes. We do this thing where we use this program called Miro, and it's sort of like a online sticky note sort of thing. And I just paste all of my codes, all of my themes in there, and then we as a team sort of like visually map out sort of how are these themes like working together, which ones can be put into larger categories. And let me tell you, there's a lot. I think I'm going to be working through this data for a while, past just this one paper I'm working on. But some of the interesting findings are there are some disabled streamers who talk to me about the issues of monetization on Twitch. If you don't know, once you reach a certain threshold of like viewers, followers, time streamed, you get the offer to become part of the Twitch affiliate program, which basically means you have more resources, you have access to monetization, actually earning money from the platform. And I talked to, in particular, this one disabled streamer in the UK who said that they weren't able to, go ahead with the affiliate program because as soon as they would start making money, if they made a sort of certain amount of money at all from streaming, they would lose their disability funds entirely from the government. And when I heard this, I was like, oh, that sucks. Like, you're just like, you get government funding, but as soon as you're able to make money streaming from home because of the accessibility of streaming for a lot of disabled people, suddenly the government is like, no, you're not disabled enough anymore. You do not get this money, which sucks. And then I guess other findings that I found, I don't have them all off the top of my head, but it's a lot of the similar stuff about, facing hate and harassment on the platform and sort of a lot of people finding community with each other. I have this like wonderful quote that I'm probably going to use at some point in a paper from my friend Non-Binary Pirate, who is a streamer, who basically said like, this is just a cute little space on the internet where I get to hang out with my friends. And like, I think a lot of these different streamer channels and communities are like that. And they're sort of like these like safe spaces for queer and trans people of color, disabled people to sort of be away from the main platform culture of Twitch. So yeah, those are just some of my findings.
Yeah, that's really terrific. And I'm assuming, I think that first finding is really important because it's so obviously just like a major oversight in the context of how Twitch, a platform that could in fact be an accessible like content creation platform for disabled folks, like just isn't thinking about the implications of its various programs. And I'm assuming, once you finally crack Twitch affiliate, you're still not making like a full amount of money by any stretch of the imagination. So that's That's really
Yeah,
disappointing.
if you want context for that,
Mm.
I have been Twitch affiliate since probably like late October because I think I got affiliate after my first month of streaming. And I've made probably in the past year and a half, I've gotten three different payments of $50. So yeah, $150 for a year and a half of streaming.
Woo! I'd actually say
Woo!
that's pretty good. Um,
Yeah,
like
yeah, I
relatively
feel lucky
speaking,
for that. Yes.
yeah. We maybe haven't quite paid off the gaming PC, but you know, we're chipping
Right,
away at
yes.
it. Amazing.
Slowly but surely.
Awesome. Well, our next question comes from, do you approach people for your interviews or do people come to you? What's the ratio?
This is a great question. Thank you. I think it's funny because I wish people would just come out of the ether and be like, interview me, interview me.
Mhm.
Because I feel like for a lot of people who do interview work, um, it's a lot of basically asking people, posting about your study, going to people specifically being like, hey, I'm a researcher at the University of Michigan School of Information. Do you want to talk to me? Um, so I would say 100% of the time it's me approaching people or people responding to calls that I've put out on like my social media. Um, and I think this comes from, as I said earlier, about like marginalized communities and sort of like making sure we let safe people into the space who are not going to ruin the sanctities, the safeness of the space from whatever marginalizations the group has. I think a lot of these marginalized groups are generally like adverse to or just unaware or just like have slightly negative leanings towards like academics coming into their spaces. Because often it can feel like this scientist, this researcher is coming in to study you, and then they're going to use your labor and extract it for a publication and never interact with you or give you any benefit of any sort. So it's completely understandable that when you go to a community, it might take a bit to earn their trust. And I've definitely experienced this with interviews. I've been banned from multiple channels because mods were like, hey, stop. And I was like, I'm just asking a question, but I understand.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of doing ethnographic and qualitative research generally. This is what we would call recruitment. Are you able to like get folks on board with your project? And the fact is, you might put out a call that's like, hey, I'm looking to talk to people and, you know, this demographic range, and maybe you'll get tons of responses or maybe you'll get none, and knowing what to do in those situations. But I think what Hibby mentioned about snowball effects is incredibly important. Once you have a few people who have talked to you and you've sort of built that trust and relationship, they're much more likely to be like, oh, you should chat with my friend. And then refer you directly to people who would also be interested. Our next question here comes from Max. What would you say is the most surprising finding that you've come across in your research?
Oh, this is a good question. I wonder what's most surprising to me. My most surprising thing, honestly, off the top of my head, is so I live in the US. I primarily conduct research in the US. So my samples are typically skewed or biased towards like Western, interviewees. But I have had non-Western interviewees from specifically like South Africa, from the Philippines, and it's been, I think the biggest surprise to me is learning about non-Western contexts with Twitch. Specifically, I talked to this gay Filipino streamer who just mentioned this difficulty with being a popular gay Filipino streamer, but whenever they're recommended to the front page of the algorithm, they get a lot of hate and harassment. So it's like they can succeed, but then by succeeding, they're exposed to more of that main platform culture. And then they also talked about how like there was a center, I think, for Twitch in Southeast Asia. It was either in the Philippines first, and then it became Southeast Asia, or it was Southeast Asia first. And then that sort of just fell apart, and then it was collapsed into Twitch Australia. So then Twitch Australia became this big center for Australia, for Southeast Asia, etc. And it's like, because you don't have the resources in your country specifically, you do not have access to like these conventions and like these different resources that people usually would have if Twitch was working within their countries. So that's just something that's been very surprising to me to see, and just sad. And hopefully more resources are given out to specific regions, countries with large streamer bases. Like I think the South African streamer also talked about there being no Twitch Africa, which, you know, sucks. But yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Just to know how that infrastructure is kind of set up. Our next question comes from who asks, what's the average initial investment that VTubers and PNGTubers make in their setup, and how does it impact successfulness?
I will say, I don't know if I know an average. I will say, however, the bigger VTubers you see succeeding on Twitch, they probably honestly have spent a lot of money on rigging up their models, and like sometimes they go through like multiple models. So they must have spent a lot of money commissioning artists to create multiple 3D models that, you know, are motion captured. So I can't really say the price range of that. I just know it's expensive. But I would say, like, for me personally, I commissioned a friend who's an artist to make copy. Their name is Remy Davis. And I forget how much I paid for this one. I want to say it was somewhere between $100 and $200. Which is usually how much I pay whenever I commission Remy for art for like D&D characters. So that's how much I spent on Hoppy. But I know other people who just use like free programs. Like I think sometimes artists make pick crews or these character creators where they're like, this is like open to anyone. You can use this for whatever purpose, and people will just create characters in those and then use that as their PNG tuber. So it can be more affordable, accessible. It can be free. You just have to, like, I guess, search out for those resources and find something that works for you. Otherwise, I know a lot of like queer and trans people who use PNG tubers and VTubers just commission like artists in their community. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Oh boy, we've got a handful of questions coming in now, so I'm gonna try and move through these so we can get to all of them. We have an upvoted question though from who I have a feeling you're gonna enjoy this question, Hibby. I noticed many VTubers and PNG tubers are associated with clowns and jesters. Do you think there is a reason people resonate and identify with clowns so much?
I love this question. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. As someone who resonates with clowns, my first answer is clowns are cool. My second, more serious answer is I just think with like PNG tubers and VTubers, the sort of like affordances it gives for identity exploration and expression is so cool. Like, you are not tied to specifically being like, this is my VTuber who looks like a human. You could be this rabbit pastel clown. You could be, I think Oliver's book talks about like there's this like plus size robot that has like circuitry for like stretch marks, which is so cool. You could be all these different like wonderful things. You're not limited to the human body. And I think clowns and jesters specifically, because of this idea of like exploration and expression, there's just so much play and whimsy to them as like just things in general. And I think queer and trans people specifically may have an affinity for clowns just because of like this, like, they're sort of seen as like at times weirdos, but they're colorful, they're playful, they're whimsical. There's something I feel like inherently queer about them. I don't have the data to actually validate that, but I would say based on vibes, yeah.
I think that's really fantastic. I will also mention if you are interested in clown theory, although it is not an area of expertise that I hold, I know the folks over in the Department of Drama are very into it. And actually, the University of Alberta and has like a very famous, I forget what the title is. It's not like Master Clown, but a very famous, like, well-respected clown that we have like in residence specifically to teach clowning. Anyway, I'll post the link if I come across it again. But yeah, our next big question here is, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about content moderation policies? Question from, or your thoughts on how power operates on digital platforms, if that makes sense.
Yes, that totally makes sense. Thank you. And I also love your, is that like Mrs. Clean? Yeah. So content moderation on platforms, let me like draw in Tarleton Gillespie's sort of like work on content moderation. So basically platforms sort of advertise themselves as this neutral space where you can have open discussion, you can connect with other people, and is a platform for you to speak about what you believe in, what you find important, etc., stuff like that. However, as a lot of us know at times through our own experiences and through research, platforms are almost never neutral. There's usually some sort of bias or skew in how, oh, thank you for posting. There's always some sort of bias or skew in how people moderate these platforms. And when I talk about moderating, I'm talking about the act of flagging, of removing content, removing accounts, banning accounts, stuff like that. Gillespie has much better wording for that, but that's what I'll say. And basically, there has been research that shows that content moderators are sort of trained in an industry way to be efficient in their content moderation practices, which means they're not taking the time to consider the context of what they're moderating. For example, I think Kishonna Gray and I think Kristen Stein, so sorry to those two if they're not the people who wrote this or whoever wrote it, but found that Facebook users, specifically Black Facebook users, would get moderated more often for using the N-word than white Facebook users. Which, you know, does not make sense when you think about it. And my advisor, Oliver, has also found in his work that platforms tend to disproportionately moderate Black users, trans users, and just marginalized users in general, because we don't fit the sort of scope of what the average user looks like to them. And that translates into algorithms as well. Because these algorithms are trained with human biases, and they reflect this like one size fits all approach where they think this is the one user, this is the average user. And so many of us do not fit that average user archetype. So our contexts are not taken into consideration. An example of this I've seen in like some other research is sort of like skin recognition technologies on like Instagram and stuff like that, and algorithms where like fat or plus size people will be moderated more often for nudity because the algorithm says there is more body here, there is more skin here than there's nudity, which sucks and is fat phobic. But that's just some ways that power operates in content moderation. People who say that the internet is a space free of racism, free of sexism, all that stuff, they're wrong.
I think that was a really well said in summary, and some thank you also so much for citing your sources. I've done my best to post links to these articles for anyone who's curious, and I'm really happy to tell you.
Oh my god, you got the exact articles, thank you.
Yes. Also, it was Kishonna Gray and Kristen Stein, so excellent memory. Yeah, really.
Grad school does great things, I guess, to my brain.
Yeah, really well summarized there. Our next question comes from asks, on a similar vein to what you mentioned about Twitch having a toxic culture to it, I've heard stories about people getting banned and demonetized and shadow banned on Twitch for little to no reason at all, typically in these cases as a form of silencing and discrimination. Is this a topic you've encountered in your interviews? And I reckon this is something that comes right alongside the conversation we were just having about content moderation.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. And yes, it 100% comes up. I've had interviewees talk about being shadow banned, which, if people don't know, shadow banning is usually this language that social media users use to talk about the reduction of scope or being sort of like made less visible on platforms. I think Tarleton Gillespie calls it reduction instead of shadow banning, but I think most people say shadow banning. That has definitely come up when I was first doing my digital ethnographic work before I started interviewing people. There was a streamer who I talk about in the article that Dr. Berge just posted, the one on Reddit and Twitch. A streamer who I believe is named Sukisha Ray, who was streaming in the pools, hot tubs, and beaches category. Basically, she was, I think, in a hot tub talking to her viewers. She was in a bikini and her areola slipped out. And because of that, she got banned on Twitch, and it was an accident. But because of the banning, she lost so much access to her following, to just like monetization in general. And then after these things happen, it gets very hard to appeal them because appeals processes on social media platforms in general can be very vague, or it can be very hard to get to actually speak with a person who will actually consider your context. So sadly, this is a thing that happens a lot. It also happens when people, or when trolls and hateful users will sort of mass report marginalized users. Like I think there's been trans streamers who get mass reported, and then the platform is like, well, we got all these reports, so we're gonna like shadow ban you or ban you, sort of thing, which sucks because it's actively hateful reporting. It's not actually reporting you for something you did wrong.
Yeah. No, that's terrific. I think we probably have time for maybe 2, maybe 3 more questions. We have a upvoted question here from can a person switch to being a VTuber or PNGTuber after building an existing platform as not one? Do you have experience, or can you share any others' experiences with this, and how viewers' responses, what viewers' responses might be? Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. Also, all of you have like great like profile pictures. Just want to let you know, your profile picture game is on point. But I will say I myself started streaming for like months just with face cam on. And I would like get all dolled up. I'd do makeup and I would like do all these things to like get prepared. And something I found in my research that I also felt was like the act of like getting so prepared to be on stream can be so exhausting at times. So that was like so convenient when I started using Hoppy as a PNG tuber, because I could just roll out of bed and be like, hey guys, hey gamers, it's me. But I'd say there is no sort of like structure or rules around when you can switch to or switch off using PNG tubers, VTubers. I have streamers I talk to who started VTubing, and then after they got more comfortable, they started using Facecam. Or I have streamers who went from Facecam to no Facecam to using a PNG tuber. It all just depends on like comfort level. But when it comes to like viewer reception, VTubers and PNG tubers were popularized in East Asia specifically. And there's a very different culture around them there. It's more like, if from what I've read, it's more like a voice actor and character sort of culture rather than a person and their fun little clown rabbit thing. And I guess in the West, I've been talking to, I'd like to also shout out Wells Lucas Santo, who I am doing VTuber work with, who has written a lot about faciality in digital cultures and post-facial like society, talking about how the face is such, the face, am I right? The face is such an interesting thing when it comes to like authenticity, because it feels like in the West, if you are not showing your face, you are perceived as inauthentic. We see this in like dating apps as well. Um, so the act of using a PNG tuber or VTuber can be looked down upon by certain people in the West. Or I think someone asked a question about like anime aesthetics in VTubers. That can also be like viewed negatively in the West as just being like just some anime character or whatever. Yeah, which sucks, but I do think, or I'm hopeful that like Western culture will grow to accept more stuff like VTubers and PNG tubers. And we see that with streamer Iron Mouse, who is like one of the most successful Twitch streamers right now, and she's a VTuber.
I think that's a really great example. Okay, we've managed to get through most of the questions, so I'm really happy. And apologies if I'm missing any here. I need you to know it's not personal. It's me doing 20 things at once, and I am not a live streamer, except when I do this. But our probably last question comes from you've mentioned that these communities you work with are pretty well insulated and close. Do you think that these communities are enough of a force to change the overall culture on Twitch, or will there eventually be a migration to some new platform?
Thank you. That's a great question and great Steven Universe profile picture. This is something I talked about with all of my interviewees. I think I had a specific question on like, what changes do you have for Twitch, and do you think that Twitch will stay basically, or do you think we'll sort of migrate to a different platform? And there were like mixed results. A lot of people were like, Twitch is here to stay, it's owned by Amazon, blah blah blah, stuff like that. And other people were like, well, if it doesn't continue to serve us as a community, then we move elsewhere. And I think that's just been the history of platforms in general. When platforms die, or when specific subsections of the platforms die, there are often platform migrations. We saw this with Twitter, or X, blit. And sorry, spaced out for 1 second. I'm trying to pull up your question again. Yeah, okay. I see, this is hard for me personally because I want to be hopeful or optimistic that these smaller communities can create change writ large across Twitch or any platform. But I think as we're seeing now with the Trump presidency and platforms sort of like pivoting on their stance related to racism, sexism, transphobia, like Meta being like, you can say racist stuff now, which sucks. I think it really depends on the platform culture itself writ large has to change. And if the platform culture doesn't change for the better, then I think marginalized people will continue to create their own spaces and find spaces to be in community and support each other. And hopefully through that, things will slowly get better and there'll be change. But yeah, that would be my answer.
I think that was a really terrific answer. Thank you, Hibby. I think we do have time for one last question, so I'm going to ask this last one from. Do you feel there's a pattern regarding which VTubers are more popular from your interviewees? Specifically interested in perhaps anime-styled VTubers? Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe not from my interviewees specifically, but I think in general, typically the most popular VTubers you see are like anime aesthetics. And there are some issues that come up with that Wells, Lucas Santo talks about in her work about sort of like digital yellowface. There are like, a large proportion of like, I guess, white streamers who may take on anime aesthetics, and like there's something there to unpack. But I think, yes, anime aesthetics are definitely some of the most popular ones that come to mind. And typically, I would say a lot of like female VTubers are more popular than male VTubers from what I've seen. And typically it's like the ones that sort of adhere to like more of a scantily clad, revealing sort of aesthetic, because unfortunately we are also streaming within a platform that is big in gaming culture. And as I said, cisgender, heterosexual, white, able-bodied men, that is seemingly more appealing to them. And that's, I would say, why those streamers are typically more popular. But I would love to see more pastel clown rabbits in the world. So
I think that's a perfect note then for us to end on. And thank you so much, Hibby, for taking the time to chat with us and for all these amazing resources. Encourage all of you to tune in to our remote class later as a PNG tuber if you feel so inclined. If I wasn't feeling like death, I would probably run class that way, because that would have saved me a lot of time rather than doing my makeup and stuff to prep for this. Perfect. Well, on that note, I'm just going to point out a couple of quick things before we part ways. If you are interested in talking more about monetization and governance on Twitch, you might check out one of our conversations last season on Playful Horizons with Christine H. Tran, who I know is a mutual friend of ours. And also, next week when we chat with Kit Chalkley, we'll hopefully be able to have more conversations around platforms and governance and how marginalized folks make up space there. So with that, I would love it if those of you who are here in chat could just post your favorite emoji to say thank you so much to Hibby for being here. This was wonderful and so enlightening. And then Hibby, we ask all of our guests to end the recording and our session here with your favorite sign off. So if you would sign us off as though this was one of your streams, that will be the end of the video.
Wow. This is
Yeah.
wow. Okay. I
I know
had
I'm a
like a few
monster.
things that came up. No, you're not a monster. I'd be like, bye girly pops, bye besties.
Perfect. Uh, well, on that beautiful note, thank you all so much for joining us. We will hopefully see you all next week. Thank you again, Hibby. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye,
Thank you
besties.
all so much. Bye besties.